Hello, everyone, and namaskar. Pleased to be here. Sorry that the speech, the opening remarks made by uh, our friend from Gujarat government, Sudhanshu Jangir, was not very clear, and therefore I like to apologize for it. Having said that, what we are facing today is this dreaded COVID-19 and a new variant called Omicron, which has really affected the whole world to a large extent. Uh, what it has also done is also put a spotlight on our vulnerabilities and is forcing all stakeholders into action. One of the issues at the forefront is that of ensuring food and nutritional security through resilient food supply chains. The progress made in mitigating global food security was already in retreat when the pandemic struck. The latest report on the state of food security and nutrition in the world by the FAO has provided a sobering reality check. Not only did the number of people experiencing undernourishment began to slowly increase from 2014, but in 2020 the world witnessed an unprecedented setback in the hunger eradication efforts. Between 720 and 811 million people in the world faced hunger in 2020, which is around 161 million more than what it was in 2019. Even as we adjust to these new realities or try to deal with them, the discussion is not over. As we speak, scientists are trying to determine if the new Omicron strain of the virus will require a more stringent response. We have already seen a swift restoration of restrictions on international travel. If the impact of the new variants intensifies, it won't be long before national authorities resort to other international and domestic restrictions like lockdowns. These may reintroduce constraints on supply chains, including those crucial for the unimpeded access to food. When we talk specifically of the BBIN region, which is Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal subregions, we note that despite being home to 21% of the world's population, it is one of the least integrated and connected subregions in the world. Moreover, the subregion faces problems of high unemployment, poverty, inequality, and is extremely vulnerable to climate related disorders or disasters. All these factors combined make the BBN subregion much more susceptible to food insecurity than similar geographies elsewhere. This pandemic has provided us with an opportunity to reevaluate how we tackle the major drivers of hunger and malnutrition and refocus our efforts to build better. I mean, that is the least we can do. Cuts International has dedicated substantial time and resources into evaluating how the BBIN subregion can develop seamless intra-regional and inter-regional connectivity to ensure the resilience of supply chains, particularly those which facilitate security of critical necessities such as food. In this attempt to build better, we must also ensure that adequate focus is given to sustainable practices such as designing green infrastructure and shifting to green transport. An efficient, environment friendly, multimodal transport system in the BBN region will promote both the resilience and the sustainability of supply chains. Today's session will focus on the best trade facilitation measures to develop a robust system for seamless cross border movement of goods. Experienced and distinguished panelists will discuss how measures to boost multimodal transport, digital connectivity, and easier customs procedures, among others, can be adopted by the four countries to ensure unimpeded access to food supplies. Moreover, it is not only a question of access alone. Economic slowdowns, downturns, and disruptions have resulted in job losses, decreased purchasing power, and a steep rise in food price inflation. As per the World Bank, the poorest countries witnessed a sharp increase in food prices in September this year, reaching the highest level since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. zone about 2 years ago. This has forced people to buy cheaper and less nutritious food. Ladies and gentlemen, greater integration in the BBIN sub-region will produce positive externalities beyond easier access to food supplies. Enabling seamless connectivity and interregional trade will bring significant welfare gains to the people of the sub-region. It will provide new employment opportunities, better choices for consumers, speedy and reliable deliveries, and low prices, ultimately boosting nutritional security in the sub-region for the most vulnerable. With that, let me thank you once again, and on behalf of Cuts International, to welcome you all to this webinar. Over to you, Sam, or is it Mr. Jangir?
Yeah, just introduce, yes, Mr. Jangir.
So, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I sincerely apologize for this technical glitch. Unfortunately, it never happened in the university, and the entire server is down from last 10 minutes. So, I welcome you on the behalf of Indian Institute of Sustainability, which is the recent initiative of Gujarat University. So, Indian Institute of Sustainability is one of the kind of institute which is working on 3 pillars: research, practice, and training, through identification, innovation, integration, and implementation. We have identified 14 core areas, which is working into agriculture, entrepreneurship, water, climate change, smart cities, smart villages, and many more. These 14 core areas have been identified according to the need of India, which is one of the largest country and one of the largest democracy. Within 1 year, we have partnered with the United Nations, Penn State University, NAFED, Niti Aayog, and recently we also partnered with the University of Ladakh, where we are going to set up one common center there. So this institute has been started 1 year back, and this is the second year of this institute. So on behalf of Gujarat University and Indian Institute of Sustainability, I welcome our speaker, Dr. A. Didar Singh, who is an author and experienced civil servant. He is a former Secretary General FICCI, who has experience to work with government as well as industry. He is skilled into public policy, government administration, strategic planning and management. Dr. Singh also functioned as a chair of the diaspora group of Kenomed of the World Bank in 2017. Sir, it is great honor for us to welcome you, sir. And we are looking forward to have great learning from you, sir. And in the future, we also welcome you at the Gujarat University.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I presume that everybody can hear me.
Yes,
I will first introduce the topic and then mention some issues about it. First of all, this particular topic today talks about resilient, sustainable supply chains, role of efficient connectivity and trade facilitation measures for food and nutrition security in the BBIN sub-region. Now, here is my first question, or let me say my first controversial statement. Why are we talking of food and nutrition security in the BBIN sub-region? Would you talk about this in Europe? Here is my question. Food and security have become an issue around the whole world after the pandemic. Why do we signal out only South Asia as issues where this can be a problem? So that's my first point. My second point is, of course, we all want resilient and sustainable supply chains. But to me, sustainability has today become a fashionable concept. Everybody talks about sustainability. But what is really sustainability? For the average human being, sustainability is only to survive in his region, to survive in his home, to survive in his city, and make enough money to manage tomorrow. So sustainability for him is a topic which is concerned more with his physical connectivity, with his physical survival, rather than sustainability as a concept of climate change. My third point, we all know that there has been a pushback against globalization. This tremendous pushback is something that we are all talking about At a global level, we are seeing it at the individual level, we are seeing it at the regional level. And we see a situation matching this pushback where the world is moving to services from the agri sector, not manufacturing. They're going straight into services. This is in fact a result of Industry 4.0, which has reduced the cost of technology and therefore made it much easier for people to mention and go straight into services area. The agri sector therefore is suffering not just in India but across the whole globe, and therefore you have problems of sustainability and you have problems of agri and food security around the whole world. And yet it's a reality that we have to face, and in that face I have only one recommendation to make, and which is my fourth point here, which is you can do nothing without private business and civil society being part of any discussion. Now you are usually going to have your discussions either with civil society separately or with business separately or with governments, little realizing that unless they're all on the same table, this issue will never get addressed. And we're seeing this particularly at BBIN. We are implementing a tremendously interesting project in Cuts on the BBIN sub-region, which Pradeep has just explained is basically Bangladesh, Bhutan, India and Nepal. In this sub-region, we are arguing that better connectivity will lead to greater development. It's not necessarily food and nutrition security, of course that will follow, but basically it means there will be greater development, there will be greater trade, there will be greater industrialization if there is better connectivity. And we've seen this very clearly in the reports that the paper that we worked on. We have seen, as Pradeep was just mentioning, this is a region which is least connected if you look at the global situation, and yet it's a region which has seen higher growth than the global average, and therefore connectivity can result in tremendous benefits for the whole region and for the people in it, including of course for food security and for all the other aspects of development that we are talking about. However, we are finding in this paper that as we discuss different aspects of connectivity, we look at some of the 4 main regions where this is happening and some of the important connectivity projects which need to get off the ground. But we are seeing that the real reason that it's not happening, or the real problem with this entire initiative, is really political consensus. That without political consensus, we are not able to move forward. And we are seeing this with, for example, the motor vehicle agreement, where 3 of the countries have agreed, but the 4th one is having some doubts about it. So how do we get to this political consensus that will bring everybody on board? There is a lot of other work to be done. There is a lot of benefits that come from this, especially in the context of climate change as we are facing today in the world. We see that domestic tools, public-private partnership, international tools, all of this helps in maintaining the entire scenario and maintaining a forum on which private sector, public sector and the government can all sit together and talk and be on the same page for the development of the region as a whole. But in this we find that political consensus is really the key of getting the whole thing off the ground. Therefore, infrastructure initiatives are crucial for the entire region. Of course they are, but to be successful, they must have political consensus. And political consensus will come when more and more projects and more research leads and shows that this connectivity is something which is extremely important and beneficial for everybody. And in doing so, prove to the political masters that having this as a benefit will actually benefit individual countries, will benefit individual regions, will benefit individual people, will benefit business, will bring more jobs, will bring more development and be beneficial to everybody as a whole. That is basically the one single theme that we need to focus on. And in this topic also, while we are talking about, of course, the overall context of greater sustainability in managing efficient connectivity and trade facilitation for food and nutrition security in the BBIN sub-region, we are basically saying that this resilience will come when you have overall development. Overall development benefits everybody as a whole, and in fact will definitely help in food and nutrition security for the BBIN sub-region. Thank you very much.
So, sir, thank you. And you have rightly mentioned that political consciousness is very, very important, specifically when you talk about food and nutritional supply chain. And especially India, Bangladesh, Nepal, these three countries, and even Bhutan, now they are democracy. In democracy, agriculture and food supply chain is always the combination of people, policy, and politics. And therefore, you have clearly mentioned, and this is a very right point. So now I invite Mr. Alexei Kravchenko, who is Economic Affairs Officer, Trade Policy and Facilitation section of the Trade, Investment and Innovation Division of the United Nations, ESCAP. His work revolves around issues of trade and sustainable development, non-tariff measures, illicit financial flows in the region. His most recent work revolved around trade and climate change. He previously worked with ICT and Disaster Risk Reduction Division at the ESCAP, which was centered on enhancing broadband connectivity within the Asia Pacific region. I welcome you, Alexei.
Thank you very much for that, and greetings, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to be invited to speak during this event, and I would like to present to you some findings and recommendations from our latest flagship report, the Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021, where we talk about climate change and its relationship to trade and investment. And the reason it's as you can see, as you'll see during the presentation, it's very relevant to the topic at hand, because the topics discussed, trade facilitation, connectivity, and everything are the center of the policy recommendations that have positive spillovers on more than just climate change. So to start with, while globalization has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the Asia Pacific region, the economic growth supported by existing trade and investment policies has come as a very steep environmental cost. Climate change is making Asia Pacific more hazardous. Greenhouse gas emissions from human activities are the main driving force behind this climate change. So Asia Pacific region accounts for just 38% of global GDP, but more than 54% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Since 1990, global greenhouse gas emissions increased by 50% globally, where in Asia Pacific region they have more than doubled. In China alone, they have quadrupled in the time frame, and in India, more than tripled. China and India are now responsible for 24% and 7% of global emissions, respectively. Yet, on per capita basis, China's emissions are less than half of those of the United States, and India's are actually 7 times less. What's more, developed countries' consumption emissions are typically higher than their territorial emissions due to the emissions embedded in international trade. So while this gap between consumption and production emission remains high, it only now accounts for a relatively small share of overall increase in the emissions since the 1990s. This means that the bulk of greenhouse gas emissions growth in the Asia Pacific region has been from the increased consumption due to increased economic development, rather than from manufacturing products destined for developed markets. So this report is focused on how trade and investment related policies can be more climate smart and help address climate change. But first of all, what exactly is the link between trade, investment, and greenhouse gas emissions? Well, first of all, trade directly contributes to emissions due to transportation and trade procedures. Trade also leads to greater economic activity, further increasing emissions. Trade-related regulations can be favorable to climate action. For example, climate-related provisions are now increasingly used in trade agreements. At the same time, some countries in the region reduce their environmental regulations to try to attract FDI. And depending on country-specific production processes, trade can either lead to increase or decreased emissions. So I'll give you an example from food here. In the United Kingdom, even accounting for transport-related emissions, New Zealand lamb actually contributes to 4 times less emissions, fewer emissions than the UK lamb, mostly because New Zealand sheep graze outside of the whole year rather than rely on brought-in feed. So the production process is very important to consider. It's not just transport. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, trade is crucial for spreading technologies to attain green economies and reduce the emissions. As part of this report, we took some stock taken, and what we found is that while there's been some improvements since 2015, all countries in the region, including in the Bangladesh, India, Bhutan, and Nepal, unfortunately we don't have enough time, data for Bhutan, have room for improvement. What can be those policies? So while we analyzed the barriers to trade in environmental, climate smart and non-environmental goods, we found that the average tariffs applied on carbon-intensive fossil fuels in Asia Pacific are lower than the tariffs applied to environmental goods. That means on average, the tariffs on coal are lower than the tariffs on fossil fuel cells or on solar panels or wind turbines. The data on non-tariff measures tell a similar story. So the first recommendation is to liberalize trade in climate smart and environmental goods and services. This can be done either unilaterally or as part of trade agreements, or perhaps some in the region you're part of, but ideally at the multilateral level. The second recommendation is to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Our simulations presented in Chapter 6 show that this to be one of the most low-hanging fruit to climate action. Latest data shows that Asia-Pacific economies spend more than $175 billion in fossil fuel subsidies. These can be potentially used much better and more directly to support people in need. The next recommendation is to adopt climate-smart non-tariff measures. At this point, economies in the Asia-Pacific region apply climate-smart non-tariff measures only to about 6.2% of imports. Some of the specific examples shown here include measures on fuel efficiency, on energy efficiency, and labeling and minimal technical requirements. While at this topic, there's also been somewhat of a push to include food labeling to show the food miles concept. However, there's been much debate. For example, if you show food miles, you would again try to assume that the biggest contributor to greenhouse emissions is actually transportation. It's not. And the general consensus is such food miles would actually be counter to the current WTO agreements, and they may cause a conflict. So at this stage, it's probably better to at least have some sort of voluntary standards on food, or better yet, climate or CO2 emissions labeling rather than food miles. That would be voluntary. So the next recommendation, and I heard this before mentioned earlier as well, that we really need to encourage climate smart investment in private sector initiatives. So there's the need to transform these 4 key industries. The energy sector obviously supports all sectors, and the key is to increase share of the renewables there. Production of cement, iron, and ore are still all emission intensives, and there's urgent need to decarbonize them. Different actions can be taken to reduce emissions in the transport sector, one of which to invest into cleaner modes of transport and technologies, and not just within countries, but also importantly cross-border to facilitate international trade, make it more efficient. The chapter in the report identifies some private sector initiatives. Some of them can be pushed and encouraged by the governments, such as sustainability reporting requirements. At the same time, some large companies are doing this on their own, for example, setting up internal carbon pricing mechanisms. And this can be particularly relevant to those markets where there are no carbon markets yet, such as India. The 5th recommendation is to accelerate trade digitalization, and this is important to improve connectivities. One of the findings is that if you go from the current relatively inefficient set of procedures to full paperless trade, for each transaction, you can save about 1.5 trees worth of carbon dioxide capturing. Now, this looks relatively small, but if you look at all the trade transactions in the Asia Pacific region, this adds up to about 400 million trees per year, which is significant. The sixth recommendation is to transition to climate smart transport. Again, every time we talk about international trade and climate change, the first thing that comes to mind is transport. And indeed, CO2 emissions from both domestic and international transport have been estimated to account for 42% of all transport-related CO2 emissions. Some of the mechanisms are described in further detail in the report, and I encourage you to look at that. But it's important to highlight that regional approaches through agreements, particularly those that facilitate movement of goods across border transport importabilities, are very important to increase efficiencies and reduce emissions. The seventh recommendation is, well, really about the international cooperation, is to incorporate climate considerations in regional and investment agreements. And we're seeing already that some countries are starting to do this. In particular, after 2005, as you can see in this graph, it's been more common to see environmental provisions, but there's scope to do a lot more. One agreement that I would like to highlight in particular is the Agreement on Climate Change Trade Sustainability, which is supported by New Zealand in collaboration with Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland. So it seeks to promote many of the recommendations I've mentioned, such as removal of fossil fuel subsidies, removing two barriers in trade in environmental goods and services, as well as developing guidelines on voluntary eco-labeling, for example, like I said, labeling of CO2 equivalent emissions on food. The eighth recommendations is to prepare for carbon pricing. As of time of this report, writing this report, only about 7.8% of GHG's emissions in the regions were covered by some sort of carbon pricing versus 21.5% globally. In addition to the difference in coverage, there's significant disparity in prices. For example, in Kazakhstan, the ETS emission trading scheme, the price is about $1.20 per ton of CO2, whereas in Sweden, 1 ton of CO2 is $137. According to some estimates, carbon prices would need to be at least $50 to $100 per ton to cost effectively reduce emissions in line with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. Nevertheless, the trend is clear, and the price of emissions will be increasingly accounting for in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond, and countries need to be prepared for that. So our analysis has shown that carbon pricing does come at significant economic cost where it's implemented, with some marginal windfalls to economies without carbon pricing schemes due to this carbon leakage. So carbon leakage happens when production processes, factories move from countries with high carbon prices to countries with low carbon prices. So to address these leakages, and these will become more prominent because the prices are increasingly going up. Some of the major trade partners outside of the region, in particular the European Union, are looking in implementing the border adjustment taxes to plug in these leakages. And in this report, we'll look at this, the impact of EU's border adjustment mechanism. And we find that overall, the impact is actually quite limited, except for South and Southwest Asia, which does include India. The ninth recommendation is to incorporate climate consideration in COVID-19 recovery spending. I know I was making this presentation, that was before the latest variant, so we looked like we're in the recovery. I'm not sure about now. I think we'll see what happens, but fingers crossed. But anyway, countries that can afford are now putting in place COVID-19 recovery packages and spending, and it's paramount that these have climate action considerations An obvious example would be investing in green technologies, green transport technologies such as railways. There are, however, some limitations in the current multilateral trade rules that make some spending a little bit more difficult, and we're hoping that this can be facilitated at the WTO level. The final recommendation is that capacity for making climate smart policies needs to be strengthened. This means that trade and investment policies need to be based on high quality research and analysis, and policies that contribute to make trade investment engines of growth while at the same time protect the environment. And in order to achieve that, there must be quality trainings made available, and we, together with our partners, UNEP and UNCTAD, are ready to support this. So before I go, let me just end on this note to emphasize that the relationship between trade and greenhouse gas emissions is not, as commonly believed, just about transport. Our consumption choices often matter more. So if you look at production of 1 kilogram of beef, for example, and I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but it is estimated to contribute to approximately 60 kilograms of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. Out of that, only about 0.3 kilograms is due to transport. 39 kilograms are due to methane emissions through belching, and 16 kilograms due to land clearing for pastures. By comparison, 1 kilogram of poultry, of chicken, contributes to only 6 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions, with similarly 0.3 kilograms due to transport. So I thank you for your attention, and I invite you to read the report for more details, and I'm available here if you have any further questions or comments. Thank you so much.
So, thank you, Alexei. It was really a very nice presentation, and I really would like to read this report, Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021. Indeed, it is the need of hour what we have done. And I'm quite impressed with the EASI framework and carbon pricing and carbon borders, all these things. Indeed, IAS, we are also working on this climate change plan, and the government of Gujarat, which is also bringing new climate change policy. So your input will be really helpful. So with this, I would like to invite Mr. Svetal Shah, who is a technical advisor, climate change for the government of Gujarat, India. Government of Gujarat is the first, the first state which brought the climate change department. So Mr. Svetal Shah is responsible for climate policy, climate actions, adaptation and mitigation strategies, climate finance, and his area of work and interest. He is spearheading activities of climate change department, which is renewable energy policies, state action plan on climate change, Covenant of Mayors of Gujarat, promotion of electrical vehicles in Gujarat, national and international collaboration, as well as state-wide climate change awareness campaigns. Indeed, we are very honored that Gujarat University is going to have first center of excellence in climate change under the leadership of Dr. Svetal Shah. So, sir, we welcome you. And now we would like to hear your experience as a policy maker. And could you please share something what Gujarat is doing with this global platform? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sudhanshuji, for your kind words. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen as well as you are audible.
Okay. So the topic is very important because as we all know that food security, water security, and energy security are very crucial for any country to have its own sovereignty and independence. And particularly we are focusing Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal region, which is South Asia region, and in all recent findings of climate change research, this region is more vulnerable to various issues. So today I would like to emphasize on some of the slow onset events, because we know disasters are danger, and we have planning and procedure to address the disasters like floods, cyclones, earthquakes, etc. But we are not prepared for such slow onset events, which are as good as major disaster like desertification, salinization, sea level rise, ocean acidification, loss of biodiversity, land and forest degradation, etc. These are a very crucial issue, and particularly we have more people who are say dependent on such natural resources in our region. So we require to safeguard them, and we require to develop a strategy so that these issues are addressed. So physical risk is there, and it has a very huge linkage on the financial and socio-economic impacts, because every such issue has a concern, and therefore we require to make a transition in today's era, so that we can have more independence in terms of energy security, food security, and water security. And this nexus is very important for us to understand as well as to address. So we require a robust policy framework. We require technological advancement in these areas, so that we can safeguard this risk from climate change and other issues through our sustainable development. Because almost 50% of the population living in this region are also economically weak, and therefore they require special attention. One of the scientists have recently coined a term for vulnerable population, that they are actually first respondents, and they are not responsible for those actions, and they have to respond first. So it is our moral duty, it is our legal duty as a country, as a nation, as a government, to address their concern and to address their safeguard issues. So we also have to internalize the environmental cost of all these things, and how we can say develop a mechanism so that natural resources dependent communities can really have say a risk abatement against the unusual say climatic patterns and environmental conditions. So adaptation and mitigation both are very strong component, but adaptation in this particular region is very crucial, because it has more impact from climate change than anywhere else. And since we have diverse say set of people, we have highly dense population, and we have various economic activities, we require to understand this metrics very well in this particular region. So definitely climate change impacts on developing countries are expected to increase regardless of mitigation efforts. So already we have say less per capita emission as compared to even world average, and we have very less per capita emission as compared to developed countries. Demand for infrastructure and agriculture, water investment that further need to adapt to climate change. So we require to focus on those infrastructure and supply chain. Adaptation links to global environmental issues with local developmental path. So very important, because globally we know that we have a robust framework and policies and things like that. But how we can percolate those things to our vulnerable communities? So that is the big challenge, because recently concluded COP26 in Glasgow, we know that climate finance has been discussed at the highest level. However, the concerns are that how we can reach or how we can bridge the gap between the demand and supply. So we demand the finance, but how it can be given? So for that, we have to have vulnerability assessment. We have to have scientific basis, so that based on that, we can identify projects and investment proposals, and in a scientific manner we can develop it. So development investment is at risk in the absence of consideration of climate variability and climate change issue. So whatever say food security measures or water security measures we are taking, we have to have internalized the environmental sustainability and climate change issues into it, so that it can be long lasting, as well as it has less say negative impacts on other parts. Then multilateral financial institution can effectively link the lending and adaptation agenda to produce synergies. So such gap we are constantly filling, and for that we really require that we have robust say linkages and synergy among our activities. We also require the growth and the development. At the same time, we have to have keep in mind the agenda which has been given under the climate change negotiations. And for that, we require to strengthen national and local institutions. So I'm very happy that in our Gujarat University, we are having this Institute of Sustainable Development. And so through such innovative mechanism at grassroots level, now they are going to say have particularly focus on various districts of Gujarat, and then at also the sub district level, block level intervention, so that this thing can be addressed particularly. We also require long-term funding arrangements to support such adaptation agenda, because we have think tanks, we have people to say implement it, but we require a robust framework so that it can be say long-lasting in long term. So therefore, we have financial institutions like NABARD and other rural as well as other cooperative banks which can support such activities. So it is our collective responsibility. It is not like that only government will do or only international organizations will do, but we have the system, and international organization, national government, sub-national and local governments, like we have municipalities or urban local bodies or our Panchayati Raj institutes, so villages. So all these people are required to get involved into this. Corporates have a specific role to play. They will have to have policies and programs which are say in consensus with all this development. We also require to have active role of civil society organization and NGOs. As an individual, we also require to make people more aware and do take benefit of such win-win sustainable say facilities which create win-win situation for their own life. So they will have livelihood from this green developments, and we will have then say things in place. So we know that climate extremes are threatening our or reversing the food security gain. So we feel that we are now right now having excess food production or things like that, but it is not so, because of the intense fertilizer use and things like that, which are not sustainable for long term. So we should be very cautious in now using those things. And if we really want to say transit to organic farming, then we also require to see the figures that what will be the yield, what will be the output, what are the input costs. So all these things are required to mainstream. Then we also know that drought, floods, storms are going to occur more frequent than what we have observed in even last century. Then we are having now great issue of wildfires. Then our ocean acidification is becoming a big issue. So we also have say erratic production of marine resources. So fish production and things like that are now getting impacted. We have now more vector-borne disease and more things to attack our crop and our biodiversity and our entire agriculture and food processing, then we also will have more extreme heat events. And we are constantly observing, even this year has been the most erratic in terms of rainfall in Gujarat. So even 2 days back we had a very heavy rainfall and things like that, which are totally destroying our natural production cycle. Malnourishment is also one of the key issue. So this all things, if we together see, then it is going to be challenging to say that we are going to achieve sustainable development targets by 2030, because we are not still internalizing everything that we require to internalize for our our economy and our ecosystem. So resource optimization in energy sector, transport sector, so unless and until we will not do a micro planning at every village level, at every block level, then we are having the issue. So we have, if we see India's nationally determined contribution, then these are very important points that we have put towards the Paris Agreement. I think this are actually India's nationally determined contribution, but are still relevant for our neighboring countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan. So we have target, or we have rather say that to put forward and further propagate a healthy and sustainable way of living based on traditions and values of conservation and moderation. So all this South Asian country, we have very strong value-based system and culture. So we require to nurture these practices and to have say local resource optimization for our food resources. And no doubt we require to be very globalized, but in terms of food supply chain, if we be localized and we have more robust planning and process for those food security, it may going to be very helpful. Then we also have many targets for our fossil fuel control, or for the reduced use of say electricity, etc. Then we also have identified some of the vulnerable sectors like particularly agriculture, water resources, Himalayan region. So in all this country, we have influence of Himalayan ecosystem. Then we also have coastal regions, which are again very vulnerable in Bangladesh, in Gujarat, in India, particularly coastal states like Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Kerala, Orissa, West Bengal. So we require particularly say strategic planning and internalizing the issues like climate change. So we have National Action Plan on Climate Change. We have various missions identified and various programs and plans going on in India, which require further boost, further priority, further mainstreaming. In Gujarat, if we talk, we under the able leadership of our Honorable Prime Minister, when he was the Chief Minister of State, we have identified climate change as one of the biggest opportunity to work on, and therefore we have converted many challenges into say opportunity. Particularly in water sector, if you see in Gujarat, we have been able to supply surface based water supply to by connecting rivers to say all 18,000 villages of the state. So these are some of the benchmark things that we have achieved, and we require to replicate such thing within the state and also within the nation and within the region, as well as we require to learn from water sector to for other sectors as well. So we have various policies and programs which are in sync with National Action Plan and our global and national targets. And similarly, we require to percolate it to every region, every sub-region, every say district level, and then up to even block level. So if we can do in this way only, we can achieve. So some of the various scheme of our department are also inclined towards the say increasing the resilience and security of the people of the state. So these are some of the figures of renewable energy that we have achieved. So out of 100 gigawatt installed capacity of renewable energy in India, 16.6 gigawatt are from Gujarat. So these are some of the very remarkable things. And definitely, I personally believe that similar potential is there even among our other subnational level and also in our region. So we require to do more learnings, sharing of more learning. And since we have similar socio-economic background and the things in our region, so I think we should definitely we should create a synergy among our action, and we should be louder, as our previous speaker said, that why only BBIN region. So every region is vulnerable, and but particularly we require to focus on our local area. So this is the last thing that I want to highlight, that water, food, and energy are very much interlinked, and we cannot say avoid any of the thing for our basic sustenance. So even before we think of say a transport sector or any other sector, building sector, these are the bases to survive, and without this we are not say going to survive for in next 40, 50, 60, 70 years. So we require a strong planning in all this area by identifying these issues. So thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I particularly thank GU SAC and Gujarat University and Indian Institute of Sustainable Development at Gujarat University for giving me this opportunity to share my views. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your nice thoughts, and we are glad to see that how Gujarat is progressing under your leadership, specifically in climate change and the climate change policy for the state of Gujarat. And as Gujarat is one of the most vulnerable state in terms of climate change, because we have 1,600 kilometers of coastal length, which is because of that, in last 3 years we have the cyclones, and what our cropping pattern is also affected a lot. So therefore, the recent initiative which has been taken by you and by the department, which is affecting the people. So thank you again. So now I would like to invite people for Q&A session for all the speakers. You can also post your questions. Is there any questions? So the presentation has been shared with everyone, even the presentation of Mr. Svetal sir and Mr. Alexei Krevanchuk sir as well. So you can download from the chat box. So many people are asking the presentations. Okay. So I think there is no questions. So which means the presentation was very clear. So I would like to thank first of all the team of International Institute of Sustainable Development, Ms. Rasmi Jose, for initiating, coordinating, and connecting us with Mr. Alexei Krevanchuk from United Nations. We also would like to thank you, Julie Grinanto, for technical coordination. Then we also would like to thank you, Sam, for today, the hosting the event. And then we also would like to thank you from CUTS International and specifically Mr. Pradeep Mehta for initial remarks, and from CUTS India, Mr. Jitin Sabu and Mr. Sharma for the coordination. Today, the speakers, Dr. Didar Singh sir, thank you again. You have mentioned very clear point that political consciousness is very important. And with this, I also invite you, whenever you come to Ahmedabad, please visit us at Gujarat University. We have recently started MBA and MSc program in agripreneurship and value chain management, where climate change is also part of the masters. I would like to thank you, the speaker, Mr. Alexei Travenchiko from United Nations ESCAP. We also invite you, whenever you come to India, please visit us at Ahmedabad. And we will also organize your meeting with all the stakeholders.
I think there's, I just noted there's one question. If you don't mind, I'd like to quickly address.
There's a question. Yeah, there's a question came in between. Yeah. Okay. So the question is, how quickly will India be able to make this transition from coal power to cleaner sources from energy? What role can international trade and finance play in this regard? So
Yeah.
I would request everybody, all the speakers, to add on this question. Yeah, Alexei, first to you.
So I don't have the numbers for India. I'm sure there's some around, but just giving you an example that's been quite prominent is Vietnam, who had, albeit on a smaller scale, very similar reliance on coal, and then they decided to subsidize installation of solar panels, and it basically was just too good. They gone over their target 3-4 times every year. So the transition is possible, and it just needs a little bit of support. And how can international trade and finance play in this regard? Well, for starters, as per my presentation, if you want them to phase out coal and use renewable energy, you don't do that by making coal cheaper and turbines and solar panels more expensive by putting high tariffs on them. It's the opposite of what you want to do. You want to facilitate import of not just the final products, the cells, but also the components, and also facilitate travel of specialists who can install them. That's the service component, right? So it's very important, either unilaterally or through trade agreements, liberalize trade in environmental and climate goods and services and the components, and that will help with the transition.
Thank you, Alexei. Dr. Singh, would you like to add some words on this question?
I just want to react to what Alexei has just mentioned about bringing the tariffs down on solar panels. We know all the solar panels come from China. So let's be a little careful about what we say, because it's also a question of domestic manufacture versus the international manufacture. And India is following a policy of encouraging domestic manufacture. That is the reason our tariffs are high. It's not because we don't want to do solar, because we've done rather good on solar, is what India has actually ended up doing, and has the largest, and you just saw these figures put out by Mr. Sweetal, that we are on the first or the second in most cases of renewable energy, where we have done tremendously good work on it. But coming back to the topic of today's discussion, which is about BBIN, may I again mention for anybody and everybody here that Cuts International has done a tremendous report, which is in the process of working with a large number of organizations in the BBIN area that will focus on connectivity. And the key to this, as already mentioned by the moderator also, is really political consensus, is what we're realizing again and again. So I would urge everybody to have a look at this report, because it's relevant for the entire world as a whole, that in any region, if you want to succeed, if you want connectivity, it will happen definitely only if there is political consensus. Otherwise, all the technology in the world becomes useless unless people agree, unless the politicians agree that this is something that they want to share with each other. And we are noticing this with the motor vehicles agreement, which 3 of the countries have agreed to, but the 4th is being a bit difficult to agree to it, and they have their own reasons for it. So if we understand and appreciate those reasons, but basically saying that the kind of research which is done in the BBIN region and in many other regions around the world leads to the kind of consensus that is necessary to implement the trade facilitation and development initiatives in the whole area, in the regions and in the world as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I request Kut's team to share the report which Dr. Singh has mentioned. I also now request Mr. Setal Sah from Government of Gujarat to add some words on this question. I again I also thank you, Mr. Setal Sah from the Government of Gujarat, who gave who explained about what the Government of Gujarat is taking all kind of initiative in this sustainable and resilient supply chain, and specifically he mentioned about all the recent initiative in the schemes. So again, I would like to thank you everybody here, and again thank you very much IIST team. Thank you. Thank you, sir.